Welcome to the Oasis Church. This is one of our table podcasts. We are sitting down to discuss our reading this last week of Ecclesiastes. So, Pastor Scott, did you read the Bible at all last week?
I did. We had plenty of time for Molly and I got in the Word, so don't worry. It wasn't all just out and about. So yeah, we got to have a nice quiet time overlooking the beautiful Sedona Red Rocks. So yes.
Awesome. Well, we're going to talk about it today, and we
Yeah.
want to invite you, if you're at home and you are stuck in your quarantined, self-isolated place, and you want to study the Bible with us, open your Bibles to Ecclesiastes. We're just going to kind of do an overview of the first 6 chapters and maybe bring out some highlights that each of us saw.
Yeah, and I think we got to also, as you're turning there, think about where Ecclesiastes sits within our Scripture. This is part of the wisdom literature. So we know the wisdom literature starts with Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, and of course Lamentations that's stuck between Jeremiah and Ezekiel. And so this is part of the wisdom literature. And so this is a very broad topic. It's usually written in very poetic type forms. We know Psalms is written very kind of song style. Proverbs is written very kind of, verse by verse, just each verse on its own. Ecclesiastes is a little bit different in its color. And I just wanted to talk real quick to us, church. This may be a hard, difficult book as you're walking through, and that's okay if it's difficult.
It's kind of depressing.
It is, yeah. And that's okay. And here's what you've got to remember. What you've got to love about the Bible is it does not shy away from tough topics. So we got to think, Job starts with a really tough topic in wisdom. The tough topic being, how could a good God allow such suffering? That's a great question. That's a great question that Job spends a lot of time answering. Ecclesiastes is asking a very similar type of question. What is the meaning? What is the purpose of life? And so that's kind of where I wanted us to really think and ponder as we look through Ecclesiastes is what is going on and what do we do when we find ourselves just depressed and upset at where life has taken us?
So, I'll dive right into chapter 1. One of the things that stuck out to me, and maybe we've heard this before, is that history is a teacher. And if we look back on history, we see things coming around, that everything is constantly regurgitating, re-showing itself. And he kind of says that here. He says, is there a thing, in verse 10, of which it is said, see, this is new. It has been already in the ages before us. There's no remembrance of former things, nor will there be any remembrance. And he goes on to say that, everything's kind of already been done. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean you can't be the first person to go to the moon? No, he's saying exploration has already been done. Finding new places. Guess what? We've already found new places. You can find some other place, but it's already been done. And I think what's really interesting is, I think about even our pandemic right now. Yeah. Have there been pandemics before? Yes. Have humans risen to the call of pandemics? Yes. Was God during prior pandemics? Yes. Is he still God right now? Yes. He kind of kicks off. He's like, if you're looking for a surprise in life, just know people have already discovered it. And so your discovery of that thing, he kind of lays the foundation. Whatever that thing is you're after, don't think you're the first one to do it.
And I think it's important because our author, the Koheleth brings out just a really cool thing. I think of the Jungle Book.
What is Koheleth, bro? That sounds like gibberish. Probably.
Yeah. So in verse 1, the words of ESV says preacher. I know every translation translates it. Some say teacher. Some say... the word is Koheleth in Hebrew. It's a really difficult word to interpret. We just don't have much to go on that. It's not a common word. And so it means really to gather, to come together. So that's the kind of the idea of the Koheleth. And that's why we just call the author, whoever he is, the Koheleth.
So it'd be fair to say this guy is sitting and there will be a bunch of people out in front of him, and he's going to give them this.
Correct.
message.
Yeah, he's going to kind of teach them. And I thought of Jungle Book, you know what I mean, in the song that they sing in Jungle Book. I've reached the top, and I had to stop, and that's what's bothering me. It seems to me like the author has gotten a great deal of wisdom, a great deal of a lot of success, and he's like, but I'm still not whole. And that's why he just has this doom and gloom, vanity of vanities. And that word vanity is like the sea foam of an ocean. You know what I mean? It's there for a moment and it just drifts away. So.
What stuck out in chapter 1 to you, Scott?
Yeah, I think what really just hit me hard is in 16, I said in my heart, I have acquired great wisdom, surpassing all who were in Jerusalem before me. My heart has a great experience of wisdom and knowledge, and I applied my heart to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. I perceived that it is also but a striving after wind. Like, that's really hard for me to understand. Like, he worked all his life, and he's like, I might as well have been chasing and trying to catch wind.
That's the opening deal in this chapter. Vanity. Everything's vanity. And to me, I know not every scholar would agree with this, but I think this book actually sets out to answer the question, what would take something that is vain and turning into something that is holy?
That's right.
Something that's worth
right.
something. And so if it's valueless, how does it get value? And I think that's one of the questions we'll get to as we move through the book.
And just to kind of piggyback off of that, and I think you're absolutely right. This is why I always say, like, without Christ, it doesn't matter if you go down on the Titanic hugging or mugging, right? Like, I mean, without Christ in your life, what is the whole point of life, right? Like, you're not taking any of it with you. You're going to die. You're going to, at some point, be forgotten. You know what I mean? Even the most famous of people aren't thought of every day as they die. And so I think that's, like, really interesting in how we think about life. And that for the Christian, that's you and I as Christians, everything we do is not for our glory, but for God's. And so we are sitting here today because people have faithfully done what the Great Commission called, to preach the gospel into all and make disciples in all nations.
That's good. And there's a good article I just read on TGC
Yeah.
that talked about preaching Christ through this book,
Yeah.
that he's going to actually be this missing puzzle piece.
Right.
Well, chapter 2, you get a little bit of the backstory. How did he acquire this great wisdom? He sought after it. And then you get his hypothesis. Would that be the way to say it? Like, he's going to test the world, see what's going to happen. And so kind of the basic outside of this book is the teacher says, look, I'm going to try everything. I'm going to see what's worth something, whether it be work or sex or marriage or, I don't know, all his gardens, his slaves. He has all sorts of things that he's going to test and say, these are indulgences on the earth. Are they worth anything? Mm-hmm. So what's his kind of mindset going into this?
You know, and I think what's really cool is the Koleth is realizing one thing. The more wisdom I gain, the tougher it becomes. Right? Like, it almost would be better to live as a simpleton. But the more I think about these things, the more I indulge in these things, the harder it becomes to find meaning in these things. Right? Like, even if I were to become a glutton and eat steak, I realize I still want steak more. And it's not fulfilling in me. And so if this sounds just like our culture, who's always trying to find more and more and more and never satisfied, this is what he's saying. I see this all around me. People are not satisfied. And there's even a vanity, starts in verse 12, of living wisely. And so walking through that right there is just so interesting. Like, even just to gain knowledge, Socrates, Plato, all these guys died for what? You know, did it actually truly matter? And so that's another thing I found so fascinating for me in verse 2 is do we realize that things we're striving after are nothing, are vanities to us? And do people live their lives that way?
So this book is really good to exercise a couple Bible study methods. One would be repetition. As you go through this book, you're going to see the same phrase repeated over and over: striving after wind, vanity of vanities, chasing after wind. He's going to talk about his own personal emotional response, that I hated what I had made. So here's the question, and here's what I would really challenge you to do is read this book. Look for the breadth of contrast. Mm-hmm. So this book is a book that contrasts two things. There's a lot about him doing stuff and finding it vain, and yet you'll get these breaths in which God's character just kind of is this alternating color in the book. And so, you know, as you get to the end of chapter 2, he's talking more about the vanity of his toil. He says, "This also I saw is from the hand of God. For apart from him, who can eat or who can have enjoyment? To the one who pleases him, God has given wisdom and knowledge and joy. But to the sinner, he's given the busyness of gathering and collecting, only to give to one who pleases God." And so you see this kind of weird, okay, there's vanity, and yet God has created some of these faculties, and they seem to be faculties that are supposed to be kind of pivoted back towards God. Another really interesting verse, lest you think, well, should I care about wisdom at all?
Yeah.
Why even read Proverbs? He says up in chapter 2, he says, then in verse 13, he says, then I saw that there is more gain in wisdom than in folly. And there is more gain in light than in darkness.
Yeah.
Which, again, is going to be a theme throughout the Bible.
Right. And we got to remember, he's kind of answering some kind of Proverbs. This is kind of like the second half of Proverbs. Proverbs is like, if you do this, and this will happen, and that's right. But just as Job and Ecclesiastes walks through, yeah, but not always, right? Like there are times when even the righteous man in Job suffers. Yeah, there's even times where as I've gained wisdom and worked hard, I'm not complete and I'm not full, right? And that's really something I think super interesting, that it's not saying Proverbs is wrong, but it is helping us answer what happens when you worked really, really hard and nothing happened. When it didn't go as the proverbial wisdom says. And that's really kind of cool, because what is he saying? Yeah, but my hope is in God. Yeah, but I found my joy in God. And it's still better to have that wisdom than to be in darkness. Yeah. And there's a great contrast there.
Another thing to watch is the progression through the book, that he is going to surrender to God's plan by the end of this book. And we won't dive into chapter 12 today, but even when he acknowledges that God is, and that's the breath, God's going to come in, it's a little bit of an alternative, that God's actually doing something in the midst of this vanity. He says even pleasing God here is also vanity and a striving after wind. So he hasn't got it yet. He's saying, it seems like this is about God, but even that feels like it wasn't about me,
Well, and I think we got to bear in mind, too, what's actually going on here, too. We have in Genesis 1 through 3, we have God created man and woman, and he gave them work to do. And he went to work. He named the animals, right? He did what God has said. So God gave work even before the fall. Then in Genesis 3, we have the fall, and what does God promise Adam? You're going to toil against this dirt, and it's going to be tough, and it's going to be hard, and it's going to be arduous. And so what we see here is we see him realizing, coming up and clashing against that. Like work was created before the fall as part of God's plan. And here we've got a toil that's a real struggle. And so he's walking through and saying, this is the nasty effect of being in a broken and fallen world.
That's right. Well, let's look at chapter 3. Chapter 3 opens with a type of poetic psalm. Yeah. And so it says, for everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven. And then he'll go on through verses 2 through 8 and literally give this kind of chant-like, it would have been very chanty in Hebrew. Yeah. Like there's a time to break down, a time to build up, a time to weep, and a time to laugh, and a time to... You can almost feel the rhythm as you read it. Any thoughts on that, Scott? Talk about repetition.
Yeah. Well, and I think of this like when I got married, there was a time of singleness, there's a time of being the bachelor, and then there's a time of being a husband. There is a time and a season.
Welcome to the club.
Yeah, right, exactly. And so my schedule, my life, every way I have thought has now radically changed. When you became a dad, your thought, your life has radically changed. And so we go through seasons in our lives. And we need to recognize what those seasons are. That it's cool that things change. Like the scariest thing for me is if we're the same people in 10 years. Yeah. It's the same, building. Things change, and there's a time for change. And that's okay. It's kind of part of God's plan.
It's interesting, though. This is a scary section because, I didn't choose to be a dad, per se. Right. The Lord gave us children. But we engaged in the acts that bring about children. You chose to be married because you got engaged. You gave her a ring. You had a wedding. This kind of echoes the uncontrollable times as well.
Sure.
That there are seasons that are coming that are 100% outside of our grasp, and we can claw at the dirt, we can try and keep from going over the cliff, and yet there are times of sorrow and distress. There's almost, because again, when you look at contrast here, breaking down, building up, weeping, laughing, mourning, dancing, casting away stones, which is basically building covenants with people and so we need to think about that when we look at not only in your own personal life, but when you look at what's going on worldwide. Yeah. Let us be very hesitant to say we understand why things are happening.
Right.
Maybe there's a time to self-isolate. There may be a time also to minister. There's all sorts of times moving on. And the real question is, who's in charge of time? Who's actually bringing about the events you cannot control? Who's allowing those things to pass? And that, to me, is where the real wrestling happens. It's not so much when, like, hey, it's time to be happy.
Right.
Great. Love that story. It's time for me to be in my house for 3 weeks. What in the world are you doing, Lord? Like, this doesn't feel good. I don't like this.
Well, and I think we see this in Jesus, right? There was times when he was tired and he still went and healed. Then there was times he was tired and got away with the Father, right? Like, two the same deals, and yet he had two different reactions. And so that's really important for us to realize, but both were glorifying God. And so this is, remember, the great commandment is to love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself. Like, both of these things have to be true in and amidst this time. And we're walking through, COVID, and I mean, it's a different world. And I mean, I think the number one thing we can all agree on, as everyone has an opinion, is these are weird times. But we know that these are times that have been appointed by God, that God is completely and sovereignly in control, and that we trust in God regardless of what happens. Why? Because we know that he loves us, he cares for us, and he desires his glory amidst us.
So the next section of 3 is going to remind us which book we're actually reading, and that is the Bible. And the Bible's primary concern is taking a fallen man and showing how God's glory is revealed in redemption through Christ. And so you say, man, I didn't see that in chapter 3. Well, this is the curse on display, dust to dust. I mean, you don't hear that language used often outside of Genesis chapter 3 when God curses Adam and says, from the dust I brought you up, from the dust you will return. And yet he says here, he says, we and the animals were alike in the sense that we're created by God and we're both going to die. And he restates the curse. He says, all go to one place. All are from the dust, and to dust all return. Which is something to remember, that we are presently underneath the curse of Adam. Mm-hmm. And yet Christ is redeeming us from that curse by taking our place. Right. Because he has taken our place. But this is a good reminder. Why are things vain? Partially because we rebelled against God. Things were not vain for Adam when he was working the garden prior to the fall. Things were as fulfilling as they possibly could be, and yet it's in our rebellion that we experience vanity.
We see this too. I think it was John Lennon of the Beatles said, the Beatles, we are bigger than Jesus. But the hard part is the Beatles never saved anyone. The Beatles never gave meaning to people's lives. It gave them some enjoyment, but that enjoyment's fleeting as long as the song is.
And one by one, they're going back to dust.
Right, and they all, what's the English proverb? At the end of the game, the kings and the pawns all wind up, you know what I mean, headed to the box, right? And that's and for us Christians, we know that's standing before the judgment seat, and that, yes, and Paul affirms this in Romans. He said, for the wages of sin is death. Like, we will all experience physical death. The question that Jesus in the New Testament seek to answer is, okay, well, what about eternity? Because if eternity is written in our hearts, and this is what I think Koleth is getting through the whole deal, like, all these physical things cannot fulfill an eternal whole, like that we have. And so the only thing that can fill an eternal whole is not temporal things, but then something eternal, and the only eternal thing is God himself.
That's good. All right, chapter 4,
Yep.
It shifts, and if you think we're moving quick, it's because we are.
Yeah.
And this is a book that you meditate over.
Yep.
You need to read each passage, think about it. It's meant to be chewed on and just kind of, how does this play out? How does this play out? Bro, I think it's hilarious that in the middle of Ecclesiastes is one of our marriage verses.
That's right.
And that kind of, and honestly, it's fitting.
Right.
Because it says, 2 are better than 1 because they have a good reward for their toil. For if they fall, one will lift up his fellow. But woe to him who is alone when he falls and has not another to lift him up. Mm-hmm. Again, if 2 lie together, they keep warm. But how can one keep warm alone? And though a man might prevail against one who is alone, 2 will withstand him. A threefold cord is not quickly broken. Why is that so good sitting in the middle of vanity? My personal opinion is because I can make my wife an idol.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If she's the point, it's vanity. Right. And that's, I don't know.
Yeah.
Speak to it.
Well, and I think we got to remember what Paul writes in Ephesians chapter 5. He says, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for it. And then, so what does he do? Your job is to present her spotless and blameless. How? By washing her with the word. All right? So, and you're right. What we can do is we can take good things that God has created, marriage, relationship, friendships, and we can easily make those idols. I know even speaking during my wedding, and I know this is, a lot of people use this marriage, but I think there's friendship in here too, because of the masculine pronouns that are used. I mean, I just had 7 guys that really came around me during amidst, are we going to have to cancel a wedding? What are we all going to do? All this kind of hoopla happening. And they just said, hey, buddy, we're with you. What do you need? How can we help you? They didn't do that mostly because they love me. They do it because they love Christ and they want to see Christ exalted in me. And the same thing happens in marriage, and the same thing happens in our own lives. Is the things are not necessarily the bad. The things are bad when we elevate them to a spot that they shouldn't be. What does Timothy Keller say? An idol is anything we look to give us what only God can truly give us. Your wife can't give you a whole eternal filling of that, eternal hole that you've got. Only Christ can do that.
By the way, sorry we almost burned your house down.
That's okay. That's all right.
I think we got your mama a little nervous when we were shooting the compound bow in the backyard.
Well, that's all right.
Oh, man. All right, chapter 5.
Yep.
Here's the big contrast. And this is the first time you're going to see it really swing in. He's mentioned it briefly before, but remember, vanity is when I'm striving for things, and yet God is going to be the contrast to that vanity. Scott, what are your thoughts on fearing God?
Yeah, I love how verse 1 starts, by the way. Guard your steps when you go to the house of God. It's for those of you that went to Jerusalem with us last summer, it was really cool because the steps leading up to the temple are uneven. And the reason for that is they want you to think of every single step as walking towards God. And we see this to be true. You don't walk into worship nonchalantly and just kind of sit down, but you walk in purposely. And that's why the steps are so. And I love that here. Guard your steps when you go to the house. Just keep them right. Keep them in front of you. Know why you're going to the house of God. You're going to worship. And how scary is it when we treat worship as mundane? And I love how it's hard to be in this time that we're in. Man, I know a lot of us are like, it was hard not to meet on Sunday. It was difficult not to meet. But how many times have I sat and how many times have I taken for granted the meeting of God? Yeah. And so I think this is a really cool lesson for us. I mean, we saw this with the Jews in Israel. God said, hey, y'all, get right. And here he goes, sends them into exile. How beautiful will it be when we go through Nehemiah and we're going to see what happens when the saints come back together.
Yeah, that's good. In verse 4, pay attention to the vow language. You get some pretty explicit scripture about what it means to make a vow to the Lord. If you don't think you're making vows to the Lord, I would take a hard pause today. There are some things that when you give your life to Christ, you're actually vowing to be obedient to the Word of God. And so don't think that just because you haven't promised a certain amount of tithe or you haven't said, Lord, I promise to do A, B, and C for you, that you're not out from under this verse. And so let's just read it. When you vow a vow to God, do not delay paying it, for he has no pleasure in fools. Pay what you vow. This is not a deterrent for vows, by the way. This is actually a way of saying God desires that you grow out of foolishness and into wisdom. Right. And he also wants you to test him insofar as it is like when you do what you say you're going to do for God, God honors that faithfully. And that's not saying if you give him $10, he gives you 1,000. That's not what I mean. I'm saying God raises up those who are obedient. And he says in James that I humble the proud, but I exalt the humble. And so there's something spiritual going on there.
Well, and this is, remember, Jesus says this in Matthew chapter 6, let your yes be your yes and your no be your no. Obviously, James picks up, says the same exact thing, let your yes be your yes and your no be your no, right? Like, there is something to be said about your word and sticking to what you say you're going to do, especially in front of God, because remember, Psalm 51, here you got David, rapes a woman, then has her husband murdered, and what does he say to God? Against you and you alone have I sinned, O Lord. Like, the breaking a vow to another person is bad, but you've ultimately broken against the vow giver, who is God, who promised what? I will never leave you nor forsake you. Like, and God fulfills what he promises. And so he expects what we promise, as much as it depends on us, what we promise, we fulfill as Christians. And that's a huge, huge witness to a world that, talk is cheap in our world. And so for us Christians, talk isn't cheap. Our word is our bond kind of an area. So
6 wraps up following the same vein that's been going on throughout this book, which is the vanity of various stuff. And so he's going to deal with wealth and honor. And then 6, he kind of hit on this a little bit in 4, but it's about, oppression and evil and what people do to other people. What did we see in 6, Scott?
And it's just, again, this is why Ecclesiastes is for the mature. We see some doom and we see some gloom and we see some what's the point and that kind of an area. And again, he's not wrong, y'all. If we're honest with ourselves, we realize that there are things that are just so confusing to us. And so I think what is interesting is in 10, whatever has come to be has already been named, and it is known what man is and what he is not able to do to dispute with one stronger than he. Just putting your trust in God, who's a whole lot stronger than where we lack. Yeah. And part of fearing of the Lord that we started back in chapter 5 is my fear of the Lord is recognizing the fact that I am small and he is unlimited. And this is the Lord's Prayer. Our Father in heaven, holy be your name. Yeah. God, you are unlimited. I am limited. God, you are perfect. I am perfect. And I love that he has directed and ordered steps. What we do is we trust in him.
Yeah. That's good stuff. And I'm glad you brought out the eternal nature of God. In verse 7, it says, all the toil of man is for his mouth, which means if you don't work, you're not going to eat. If you don't eat, you're going to lose weight and eventually die. And it says, yet his appetite is not satisfied. There's a really good C.S. Lewis quote, which I'm about to butcher. Where he says, if I find myself in a world in which nothing can satisfy me, it must mean I was made for a different world. Right. And so this, again, is the curtain kind of drawing back. There's a lot of philosophical just kind of pondering on Ecclesiastes. If I can't be satisfied by this stuff, then maybe I wasn't made for that stuff. Maybe I was made for something else. Jesus will say this about a treasure. Don't put your treasure into things that the moth eats and rust eats. He says put your treasure in things that are eternal in heaven where it never fails. And so even Jesus will double down on this. You are not made for this world. You're made for an eternal destination. And so, which is neat. It's kind of cool. Jesus, when he talks about being filled up with God, says, out of your heart will come streams of living water, eternal streams of living water. Like they'll never stop. You'll never run out of what he gives.
Well, and I think I actually remember one of your first sermons here at the Oasis was a year ago, January. You asked the question, man, have you bought someone to Christ? Meaning, have you invested into someone, buying them coffee, buying them lunch so that they can know who God is? And that's the great question that we have before us. Like, is our toil going to, as our elder Mark Harris said, is our toil going towards kingdom things? Like, is it going towards building the kingdom, or is it going towards building the kingdom of I? And that's the question we really have to ask. Like, do we see our homes as God's homes that we're just stewards of? And to radically think our cars, do we see our cars as stewards for God, for his glory? Is that how we think about things? And I think that's just a really wise way to look at this. So.
That's good. Well, church, thanks for studying Ecclesiastes with us today. This has just been a brief overview of 1 through 6. Scott, I want to ask you, man, will you pray for the church, and just as we are stuck in our homes and we have some downtime, that the Word of God would just transform us?
Absolutely. Let's pray. Father, I'm reminded of the Lord's Prayer. God, I remember preaching on it in January and how I was just struck by the fact that it's so much about us exalting you. And I know there's a lot of worry and fear, God, going on right now about what is to come, what is to happen. But God, you remind us that you are the God of the heavens, not the heavens, but the heavens, and the heavens, heavens, that this world, this universe cannot contain you. You are that great and mighty. And God, that is who you are. Father God, in amidst weird times, God, let this be a time of just refreshment where we get to study and learn about you. God, let us be a people who are just encapsulated by how amazing you are, Father. And God, let us be a people We strive after holiness. God, give us wisdom and direction on how we are to glorify you amidst this time. And God, we are just so thankful for your Son, for we determine to know nothing but him and him crucified. Father, be with us this next week. God, let us just be a people who you can call your sons and daughters. Lord, we love you. We worship you. In your son's name we pray. Amen.
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 We'll see you later, church.